You ever notice how life becomes strangely quiet the moment you turn your attention inward? How the noise of the world, the endless chatter of other people's opinions, expectations, and judgments suddenly fades into the background the moment you begin observing yourself instead of them. It's almost unsettling, isn't it? How unfamiliar you become to yourself the instant you try to watch your own mind the way you watch others. You've spent so many years noticing the flaws, the patterns, the inconsistencies in the people around you that you never realized how little time you've spent noticing the same things in your own thoughts. And so here you stand, somewhere between who you think you are and who you actually are, caught in the gentle tension of a truth you've avoided without ever meaning to avoid it. Because the moment you turn inward, the moment you watch the way your thoughts rise and fall, the way emotions dance through your chest, the way habits appear before you can even name them, you realize something quietly profound. You've been living unconsciously, guided by forces you never questioned, shaped by moments you barely remember, influenced by people who never knew the power they had over you. You begin to see how your reactions aren't random, how your insecurities have roots, how your behaviors have patterns carved into them like grooves in stone. And suddenly, the paradox reveals itself. You've spent so long observing others to understand the world, yet the world you've been trying to understand has always been unfolding inside you. But this realization doesn't arrive with fireworks or dramatic music. It arrives softly, like the sound of your own breath echoing in a silent room. You find yourself sitting alone, maybe in your bedroom at night, maybe in your car after a long day, maybe in the kitchen while everyone else is asleep. And a question rises from somewhere deep within you. What if the real mystery is me? And that single question opens something. It exposes something. It interrupts the rhythm of your familiar life. Suddenly, the things you once judged in others reveal themselves as reflections of your own inner patterns. That impatience, you feel it too. That insecurity, you've carried it for years. That need for validation. It echoes in the quiet corners of your mind. And as you observe yourself, really observe, you begin to notice how automatic you are, how you react before you think, how you defend before you understand, how you speak without pausing to hear yourself, how your beliefs weren't chosen so much as inherited, how your fears didn't appear, they were taught. And for the first time, you see the invisible machinery of your mind, the assumptions running in the background, the stories you tell yourself without realizing you're telling them, the ancient emotional algorithms that trigger you in predictable ways. You see how you reach for certainty when you're anxious, how you withdraw when you feel misunderstood, how you pretend to be okay, because you've been trained to hide the parts of you that tremble. And the more you observe, the more honest everything becomes. Not painful, just honest. You notice the moment your voice shifts because you're trying to sound confident. You notice the way your posture changes when someone you admire enters the room. You notice how quickly you judge yourself the moment you feel vulnerable. You notice how much energy you spend performing a version of you that doesn't feel fully alive. And this awareness, it doesn't shame you. It liberates you. Because now, instead of living as a character you unconsciously built, you begin to see the raw, unfiltered human behind the mask. You begin to see yourself the way you've always seen others, with curiosity, with compassion, with a little sadness and a little awe. But awareness is a doorway, and like all doorways, it leads somewhere. It leads into the everyday illusions that shape your life, into the scenes you participate in, without realizing the scripts were handed to you long before you ever learned to write your own lines. You start noticing the social rituals that used to feel natural, the polite smiles that hide discomfort, the small talk that fills the silence, the subtle performances that everyone participates in, but no one acknowledges. At a family gathering, you watch the same patterns repeat every year. Someone tries to impress, Someone else tries to dominate. Someone stays quiet because they feel invisible. Someone laughs louder than they actually feel. You've seen these dynamics your whole life, but now, as you observe yourself inside them, everything looks different. You see when you shrink yourself to keep the peace. You see when you mirror someone's energy because you want them to like you. You see how you mold yourself into whatever role feels safest in the moment. You see how you disappear in rooms where your truth doesn't fit. You begin recognizing the illusions not just around you but within you. The ways you hide your confusion behind certainty, your sensitivity behind logic, your hurt behind humor. And this is where the world starts to shift, not because the world changed, but because you started looking. You're no longer just observing others, you're observing the observer. You're noticing the self you bring into every room, the stories you replay, the masks you lift and lower without realizing your hands are moving. You're seeing how your mind creates meaning, how your emotions color your perception, how your assumptions silently steer your choices. And now, as this doorway widens, as the illusions melt a little under the warmth of awareness, something begins to stir at the edge of your consciousness, a quiet awakening, waiting patiently to be named. When you finally pause long enough to notice the quiet ripple moving beneath your own thoughts, something strange begins to happen. Something subtle, something unsettling, something quietly miraculous. You begin to observe yourself, not the world, not the masks people wear, not the performances everyone seems to be endlessly rehearsing. You observe you, and for a moment, it feels like walking into a room you've lived in your entire life but never truly seen before. There's a stillness in that realization, a slow exhale of truth you didn't know you'd been holding, as if some deeper part of you had been waiting, patiently, silently, for you to finally look inward. Because isn't it strange? You spend so much of your life reading other people, their moods, their reactions, their disappointments, their silence. You decode the way they glance at you or the way they don't. You imagine what they might be thinking, whether their thoughts include you, exclude you, judge you, misunderstand you. And yet, through all this careful attention to the outside world, you often overlook the one person who never leaves your side, yourself. It's a quiet paradox, how you can be so attuned to others, yet so unfamiliar with your own inner movements. And so, the question begins to echo, soft but unignorable. What happens when you stop observing the world and start observing yourself instead? This moment, right here, is the seed of the shift. Because the world you think you're living in isn't the world you're living in. You're living in the world inside you. The stories, reactions, interpretations, and self-constructed meanings woven around every moment. And when you finally begin to see that, really see it, the ground starts to tilt. This is where the awakening begins. Because most people live inside a kind of everyday illusion, a subtle, hypnotic trance so ordinary that they mistake it for reality. They wake up not to consciousness, but to habit. They put on their clothes, their personalities, their familiar patterns, as if the day itself were a stage they already know the script for. They go to work, they interact, they nod, smile, speak, agree, disagree, all without ever noticing the quiet machinery inside them that makes all these decisions happen. They move through the world as if they're participating in something external, but inside, 1,000 invisible reactions flicker and spark like lightning beneath the skin. You see it everywhere once you begin to notice. At the cafe, where someone forces a laugh just a little too loudly to hide the insecurity trembling beneath their voice. At work, where people defend ideas not because they believe in them, but because they're terrified of appearing wrong. At family gatherings, where everyone plays the old characters they were assigned decades ago, repeating emotional lines that were never theirs to begin with. You watch someone pretend they're not hurt when they clearly are. You watch someone swallow their truth because honesty would disrupt the fragile peace everyone pretends is natural. You watch people talk at each other instead of to each other. And strangely, you realize you've done the same, not because you're deceptive, not because you're weak, but because you were never taught to observe the observer, the one inside you, the one who flinches, reacts, protects, and hides. This is the everyday illusion, not that people lie, but that they don't know themselves well enough to speak honestly. Not that they pretend, but that they don't realize they're pretending. And the most fascinating part? Before you learn to notice this in others, you live fully inside that illusion yourself. You mistook your reactions for truth. You mistook your impulses for identity. You mistook your emotions for evidence. The unexamined self becomes a kind of mask you forget you're wearing. And most people, without ever knowing it, spend their entire lives trapped inside their own unobserved patterns. But something begins to shift the moment you turn the lens inward. You start catching yourself in the act, catching the rise of irritation before it becomes anger, catching the moment of insecurity before it becomes defensiveness, catching the subtle need for approval before it takes control of your choices. It's like watching a movie you've seen 1,000 times, but suddenly realizing you never understood the plot. You may find yourself sitting in a conversation and suddenly noticing how your shoulders tense when someone disagrees with you. You may notice how you smile to ease the discomfort of silence, or how your voice changes when you want to impress someone. You may notice how quickly your mind leaps into comparison, judgment, or fear, reflexes you never consciously chose. These micro moments are small, but they reveal everything, because the illusion begins to crumble the moment you start observing yourself with the same intensity you've used to observe others. You begin to see that your reactions are not you, they're habits. Your fears are not you, they're echoes. Your judgments are not truth, they're protection. And suddenly, the world becomes less about what others are doing and more about the strange, subtle, private landscape inside you. A landscape you've lived in but never explored. This inner observation doesn't make life easier at first. In fact, it makes everything a little too clear. You begin to notice contradictions in yourself. You begin to see the gap between who you think you are and how you actually behave. And in that clarity, a new kind of tension arises. A quiet, haunting question that whispers beneath your awareness. If you are not your reactions, then who are you? And then something unexpected happens, quietly, like a soft shift in the air, like the moment before rain when everything holds its breath. You begin to awaken, not in the dramatic, cinematic way people imagine, but in a subtle, unsettling way that feels more like losing your balance than finding it. Awareness doesn't arrive gently, it arrives like a light suddenly turned on in a room you've been sitting in for years. It reveals things you hoped weren't there, old wounds you disguised as personality traits, insecurities you dressed as confidence, fears you painted as ambition. You notice how often you seek validation not because you need approval, but because you're afraid of emptiness. You see the tension in your chest when you speak your truth, not because it's wrong, but because you're terrified someone might walk away if they hear it. You catch the flicker of jealousy, not because you want what others have, but because you've quietly abandoned parts of yourself. This awakening is disorienting. You start to see the motives beneath your actions, the emotions beneath your words, the stories beneath your beliefs. You begin to understand that you've been living in two worlds all along, the world everyone sees, and the world that only you can feel. And for the first time, you're no longer confusing the two. But awakening is not peaceful, not at first. It's the moment a person realizes the water they've been swimming in their whole life is water. It's a fish discovering the ocean around it. It's the awareness that your life has been shaped not by truth, but by unconscious patterns inherited from childhood, culture, fear, and longing. And once you see those patterns, you cannot unsee them. You cannot go back to sleep. This clarity feels like a blessing and a burden at the same time. A blessing because you finally understand yourself. A burden because understanding yourself separates you from the world you used to belong to. Awareness creates distance between you and who you were, between you and the people who are still asleep, between you and the illusions you once believed without question. And in that distance, something else quietly emerges: isolation. Because awareness doesn't just open your eyes, it changes the way you relate to everything around you. Suddenly, conversations feel different. You watch people speak from wounds they don't know they have. You see someone reacting defensively, not because they're angry at you, but because they feel unseen in ways they cannot articulate. You hear the silent tremor beneath someone's laughter, the unspoken story behind their confidence, the longing behind their cruelty. And strangely, you realize that most conflict has nothing to do with truth. It has everything to do with pain. But now that you can see it deeply and clearly, you find yourself standing on the outside of interactions you once participated in. You're not judging, you're observing. You're not withdrawing, you're seeing. But to others, your silence becomes misinterpreted. Your softness becomes misunderstood. Your understanding becomes mistaken for distance. People sense that you're not reacting the way you used to, and it confuses them. They're used to the old version of you, the one who engaged in the same emotional patterns, the one who mirrored their defensiveness, the one who matched their energy without question. But now you simply watch, you breathe, you choose. And this level of presence makes them uncomfortable. They don't know what to do with someone who isn't unconsciously playing the emotional games everyone else plays. And so you begin to feel it, the quiet loneliness of waking up in a room where everyone else is still dreaming. It's a strange kind of solitude, not born from lack of connection, but from depth of perception. You begin to understand how rare it is for people to genuinely see each other. You begin to realize how often conversations are just parallel monologues. You notice how people cling to their narratives because they fear who they might be without them. And the more clearly you see these things, the harder it becomes to participate in surface-level exchanges. The world starts to feel like a theatre you used to enjoy, but now cannot unsee as a performance. You feel like someone who has stepped backstage and discovered that the curtains, props, and scripts were never real. And once you've seen the strings, it's difficult to pretend you haven't. This isolation is not dramatic. It's subtle. It's the silence you feel in a crowded room. It's the disconnect that arises when others laugh and you sense the insecurity beneath it. It's the moment someone vents their frustration and you can see the childhood wound behind their anger, but you know they are not ready to see it themselves. You carry this awareness quietly, like a secret you didn't ask for, but now cannot put down. There's a heaviness to it, not because you pity others, but because you finally understand how deeply everyone is fighting battles they can't name. And so you withdraw, not because you're superior, but because you're sensitive. Not because you judge them, but because you're learning to listen to yourself. You become more selective with your energy, more careful with your words, more intentional with your presence, and people notice. Some pull closer, sensing your calm like warmth in a cold world. Others pull away, threatened by a stillness they cannot understand. You become, in a way, a mirror. Some people see themselves in you and are grateful. Others see themselves in you and recoil. Isolation becomes the quiet price of awakening. Because the more deeply you observe yourself, the more you realize how rarely others have done the same. And something in you aches, not because you're alone, but because you're surrounded by people who don't yet know themselves. You watch the world move with urgency, insecurity, ego, projection, expectation, and all you want is simplicity. Honesty, stillness, a moment of realness, a moment without masks. But until someone else awakens too, until someone else begins to observe themselves with the same depth, you often stand at the edge of conversations like a visitor in your own life. Not disconnected, but quietly apart. Not lost, but no longer willing to get lost in illusions. Isolation becomes your teacher. It shows you the cost of awareness, and it prepares you for the next stage, the conflict between who you used to be and who you are becoming. And then comes the conflict, the uneasy crossroads where your awakening collides with your old identity, as if two versions of you are standing face to face, each asking the other, "Who are you now?" You begin to wrestle with choices you never had to consider before, whether to tell someone the truth you see so clearly or spare them the discomfort of being seen, whether to speak up when a friend repeats the same unconscious patterns, or remain silent and let them walk their familiar loop, whether to be the mirror or the witness. You feel pulled between two instincts, the instinct to help and the instinct to protect your peace. You know that your silence might allow someone to continue suffering in the dark, but your honesty might shine a light they are not ready to face. This is the dilemma of the observer. You see the underlying fear behind someone's anger, yet you sense that naming it would break them. You hear the insecurity wrapped inside someone's arrogance, but exposing it would feel cruel. You want to guide, to soften, to lift, but you realize that guidance without readiness becomes intrusion. And so your heart becomes a battlefield where compassion and boundaries collide, where understanding and restraint twist around each other like two vines fighting for room to grow. You're no longer fighting with people, you're fighting with yourself, because part of you wants to return to the simplicity of reacting, while another part knows you can never again pretend you don't see what you see. You begin to feel the tension of living in a world that thrives on unconsciousness while you are trying to remain awake. The conflict sharpens your edges, blurs your certainty, and leaves you walking a tightrope between being true to yourself and staying connected to others. And in this inner tug of war, something slowly begins to crack. That crack widens into the collapse, a quiet breaking that doesn't look like drama from the outside, but feels like a storm inside your chest. You grow exhausted, not from life itself, but from the constant act of perceiving, feeling, absorbing. You start to understand why so many people choose to stay asleep, why they follow routines without questioning, why they numb their emotions instead of facing them. Awareness is heavy. Seeing through illusions is demanding. Observing your own mind every hour of every day can feel like carrying a mirror that grows heavier each time you look into it. You notice that you're becoming hyper-attuned to everything. A shift in someone's tone, a slight delay in their response, the emotional charge hidden inside a casual sentence. You start analyzing everything, not because you want to, but because you've learned how to. And now the ability won't turn off. You become overwhelmed by subtle tensions others don't even sense, and you begin to drown in insights you never asked for. It feels as if your inner world has become a room filled with hundreds of open windows, each letting in a different wind, each carrying a different emotion, and you're trying to hold them all at once. This is the burnout of heightened awareness, the moment when your mind becomes too loud, your heart becomes too heavy, and your soul becomes too tired from feeling everything so deeply. You might even find yourself longing for ignorance, craving the old version of you who didn't think so much, who didn't feel so intensely, who could laugh without hearing the sadness behind the joke. The collapse isn't a failure, it's a necessary breaking, a cleansing, a point where your psyche says, you cannot carry all of this anymore. And in this unraveling, something surprising begins to emerge, not destruction, but space. Space for a new kind of seeing. From that space, slowly, gently, comes the revelation, a soft but powerful realization that awareness was never meant to be a burden. You were simply holding it wrong. You begin to see that you can observe without absorbing, witness without carrying, understand without interfering. The deepest wisdom is not about fixing everything you see. It is about accepting that people must awaken on their own timeline. You realize you are not responsible for healing everyone, nor are you responsible for preventing their pain. Their pain shapes them just as your pain shaped you. Their confusion is part of their path, just as your confusion was part of yours. You understand that awareness becomes suffering only when you try to manage the world instead of meeting it. And so you learn boundaries, not walls, not avoidance, but compassionate clarity. Boundaries that allow you to say, I see what you're going through, but it is not mine to hold. You begin to engage with life more softly, without forcing outcomes, without trying to predict emotional weather, without trying to rescue everyone from their storms. You start letting people experience their own lessons, even when it hurts to watch, because you trust that awakening cannot be handed to someone. It must rise within them. This revelation frees you. You begin to relax into your awareness instead of tightening around it. You start to see that observations are not obligations. Feelings are not warnings. Insight is not responsibility. And somewhere in that shift, your peace returns, not the peace of ignorance, but the peace of perspective. You understand that being awake doesn't require being overwhelmed, and seeing deeply doesn't require suffering deeply. Awareness becomes your ally rather than your burden. You begin to live from a center that is calm, steady, grounded, not because the world changed, but because you no longer feel the need to control it. And for the first time, you feel the quiet strength of someone who understands themselves enough to move softly through a loud world. And finally comes the integration, the gentle closing of the circle where everything you've learned folds back into who you are becoming. You return to yourself, not the self shaped by childhood, culture, fear, or imitation, but the self revealed beneath all the noise. You begin to live with a new kind of ease, not because life is easier, but because you are no longer resisting its complexity. You walk through the world with a presence that feels both grounded and light, both open and protected. You connect with people not by absorbing their emotions, but by meeting them where they are. You observe yourself not with judgment, but with curiosity. You engage with life not to escape yourself, but to express yourself. And slowly, gently, beautifully, you begin to trust that knowing yourself is enough, that clarity is not a weapon, but a lantern, that awareness is not a burden, but a guide, that solitude is not emptiness, but spaciousness. You no longer fear your depth because you finally understand how to live with it. You no longer feel separate from the world because you've learned how to stay connected without losing yourself. And in this integration, something subtle but profound unfolds. Peace. Not the peace that comes from avoiding difficulty, but the peace that comes from understanding your own nature. You realize the journey was never about escaping unconsciousness. It was about learning how to carry consciousness with grace. It was about becoming the observer without abandoning the participant. It was about seeing yourself clearly enough to stop getting lost in the noise of others. And so you return to the beginning, the moment you shifted your gaze from others to yourself. And you understand now that this was the doorway to awakening, isolation, conflict, collapse, revelation, and finally integration. You understand that self-observation is not the end of the journey. It is the path itself, and as you continue walking it, you become someone who moves through life not asleep, not overwhelmed, but awake, quietly, gently, fully awake.